This first vignette is a very introductive vignette, so I will be talking about installing R and as well as a little bit of history of R, a very, very limited history and overview of R. Um, what I'll do is, as I said, just very briefly present the language to start with. So the first thing I want to mention is that R, um, as is quite well known, started out as a language for statistics, and it's actually an open source version of a language that was called S. And R started out in 1993, so quite some time ago. It's been around for a while, and so here I'm showing some code. So for the moment, of course, I haven't introduced most of the code, but you can come back to this later. This is just showing the last few lines in the result. So tail always, it's a Unix command that gives you the the tail end of a file. And so in this case, what it's doing, it's using a package, and I'll come back to that later as well, called R versions, and it's calling the function R versions, which is displaying some versions of R and displaying the last 8 in that file. So if you look, these are the most recent versions. So we are currently in version 4.3.3. It's called Angel Food Cake. It was pushed on the 29th of February this year, which of course is something that quite nice. So when you can see the latest versions there, it's progressing normally as a language should. So one of the reasons, for instance, me as a modeler, I use a lot of R, is that it's actually a language that uses a lot of other languages. So R does not implement everything that it does. In fact, what it does is it does a lot of interfacing with existing functions in other languages. So for example, here I am giving you a quote from DSolve, which is one package that we will see a lot in these vignettes. And you can see that what it's saying is that the functions in this library provide an interface to Fortran functions. It provides, so from something that's called ODE-PAC, which is a really well-established library to study ordinary differential equations. It provides an interface to Fortran functions, DVODE, etc., and C implementations of solvers of the Runge-Kutta family. Okay, so this is telling you that the program itself, R itself, is not doing all of this internally. It's actually linking to very well-established software that's been around since the early 70s or even late 60s for some. Okay, so extremely well optimized software, and R is not trying to reinvent the wheel, it is linking to this. Another advantage I find to R is that it's a very active field. So it's, I mean, the same is true, and even the same is, it's less active than is Python, but I do prefer R to Python. And so, for instance, if you look at Stack Overflow and ask how many questions, so I should make this bigger. How many questions were tagged with the word R in Stack Overflow, and you can see that the answer is 500,000, and something. So that means that this has a very good consequences, but if you're looking for help about R, it is very likely that the information is present and that you can access it very easily. And this also means that Google Gemini or ChatGPT, similar software as this, are going to be very good at answering questions about R because there is so much data that is available about it. So if you are using one of those large language models, you will see that asking them to produce some code about R is usually quite successful. It does require a lot of debugging, well, I mean, some amount of debugging, but it's a good starting point for many things. So, a few characteristics about R. R is a scripted language. This means it is a language that is interpreted in real time. So when you type an instruction, that instruction is evaluated after you've entered it. But I will say something, and I will have a vignette about this, that the sort of problem with an interactive language like this is that what you're doing stays in memory, and so it may happen that what you are seeing, I mean what is in your program's memory is not what you have written, because you've, for example, decided at one point that you wanted to multiply some quantity by 2, and so now your variable is twice the original variable. So I really recommend, as indicated here, to from time to time use a command line version of R. And as I said, I will come back to that at some point. Now, if you are a MATLAB or Python person, it is a very similar language to MATLAB or Python, but of course there are differences, because otherwise why would we do this? But this means also, again, coming back to ChatGPT or Google Gemini, is that there is a very good capacity. If you know Python, for example, you can ask ChatGPT or Gemini to translate your Python into R, and it does a relatively good job, usually. Now, in terms of installing R itself, the most important website to know when you're dealing with R is this comprehensive R archive network. It's called CRAN, and this is where everything that R does is downloadable, essentially. I mean, it's the main source. And so in terms of installing R, if you go to CRAN, again, I will magnify a bit, you will see that at the top there is download and install R, and there are links for Windows, Mac, and Linux. So you just download the file, click on it. I'm not entirely sure how things work under Mac, but for Windows, you just click and that will install R. For Linux, I should point out that there is a little issue that is easily resolved. It's that your Linux distribution, so I typically use Ubuntu or Pop! OS, which are both Debian-based distributions, but there's, like, for example, you could be on a Fedora or something like this. Typically, the version of R that ships with your distribution is not the most recent. So, for example, I think the current not bleeding edge Debian install ships with an R version that is a year and a half or 2 years old. But it is easy, and the instructions are on CRAN, and I've linked them here. It is easy to set up the repos, etc., in such a way that your installation is of the latest R, or so for example, if you go to follow the Ubuntu links, they explain how to get the packaging so that you end up with a recent version of R. So this is for Linux users. And the last thing I want to say here is talk a little bit about development environments. So there's a variety, and I will talk about most of them in specific vignettes, so I'm not going to go into details here. But typically when you install R, you end up with a terminal version. So under Linux, it just means you type R and you end up in your terminal, and you end up in an R session. In Windows, there's a dedicated little window that appears, but this is not a very friendly way of using the program. The other option is Radeon, which is a slightly more evolved, I don't have anything planned about this, but it's a slightly more evolved console, which has better completion of commands and etc. As I pointed out, there is also the option of running the code from the command line directly as a file. So this is done using the command rscript and then the name of your script file. And I'll have a specific vignette on this. I think this is really important if there are tasks that you want to automatize. So for example, for Unix people, you know that you can run a command every day or every week or etc. and that runs in cron. But as I pointed out earlier also, running from a command line is a good idea, just in the sense that it allows you to check that your code is self-contained. I'll come back to that. You can also integrate R into Jupyter Notebooks or in Visual Studio Code. I haven't planned vignettes about this yet, but I probably will. And then finally, you can use integrated development environments, and I'll just point out RStudio, which is what most people use most of the time. And there's a bunch of vignettes on this. I mean, there's a vignette on RStudio and then I go into details about the different options. And there's also a program called RKWard that I'll just mention briefly. The advantage being that that program comes as part of Debian-based or other distributions. I think it's made by KDE, and the advantage is that it runs on ARM processors. So that means that if you have, for example, a Raspberry Pi, a Chromebook that is on ARM, then you can install this version. I'll point out other things later about this, but this is it for the introduction and installation of R.